Hi, my name is Samantha Good, and I'm a candidate for Master's of Communications at Queen's University of Charlotte. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to spend some time explaining and going into a little bit of detail about an article entitled Wrongful Conviction, The American Experience, written by C. Ronald Huff at the School of Social Ecology at the University of California in Irvine. In the first paragraph of this article, Dr. Huff gives an overview of what he's going to talk about for the remainder of the article. He starts off by noting that there's been an increase in the number of high-profile wrongful conviction cases in the U.S., and that's part of what's brought this issue to light. It's become more and more common on the public policy agendas of politicians. There's also been an increase in scholarly research on this subject for both U.S. and Canada. Dr. Huff does a lot of comparing between the U.S. and Canada because the judicial systems are similar, and so you see that multiple places throughout the article. The main things that he focuses on throughout the article, he mentions this, are the extent to which these errors may occur, what we believe the major causes of these errors to be, any recent legislative developments as they pertain to wrongful conviction. And the intention of this article is really to develop a better understanding of what's going on with this problem so that we can take steps as a society towards fixing it. So a little bit of background, and nothing too important here, but Dr. Huff just explains a little bit of detail about wrongful convictions and how the history dates back to the colonial era of the United States while we were still a colony of England. During that time, convictions were often driven by people's socioeconomic status, and a lot of citizens who were convicted of what are called index crimes, which are the most serious crimes as we think of them today, were denied the type of due process that we would expect in the legal system today. So an attorney, whether you can afford one or not, and the ability to be tried by a jury of your peers. Moving on from background into the current research, when you think about research on wrongful convictions, it really was started by Borchardt in the year 1932. And for the next half-decade, most of the research that was done primarily focused on individual cases. So if somebody was wrongfully convicted and that information came to light, what were the errors that happened during that specific issue? During 1990, research and media really shifted to a more systemic view of what the public policy on this issue was, and that is really juxtaposed with some of the high-profile cases that were mentioned prior, and some of the changing of media and public opinion. There is one study that argues that 23 innocent people have already been put to death in the U.S., and there's unfortunately no credible systemic method for estimating the extent to which wrongful convictions occur in the U.S. So really what that's telling us is that we can make an assumption, we can extrapolate certain numbers, or we can take a test based on what judges may believe to be true, but the thought behind a wrongful conviction is that somebody who's sitting in prison right now could be innocent and have been wrongfully convicted, and we wouldn't have that data. So it's a really difficult thing to put quantitative information behind, and so unfortunately a lot of the guesses that we have on what the stats are here in the U.S. are just that, they're estimates. Alright, so why does this happen? What are the primary causes of potential wrongful conviction here in the U.S.? So the main one, and this is stated over and over again, and I believe the statistic that was mentioned in the article is 83% of wrongful convictions that are later overturned are a conviction that was rested upon eyewitness error. So eyewitness error is consistently named as the number one. Law enforcement misconduct or overzealous law enforcement perjury, so if somebody just lies on the stand. Misleading lineups, so when you're putting people in front of a room and asking somebody to say who committed the crime. Inappropriate use of informants in the jail, or ineffective counsel. So ineffective counsel is an interesting one because that can be driven by budget, depending on what the victim of a wrongful conviction has to pay for counsel, and also guilty plea wholesalers. So there's kind of a whole industry of attorneys in the United States who don't do any investigation on a crime, and they make a living by simply entering a guilty plea on behalf of their client and then receive a sum for that, and argue with the client that they'll spend less time in jail, or it's easier to to enter into a guilty plea than to do an investigation. There's also often community pressure for convictions, so if something is really high profile, people want to get it done and want to see a conviction. Forensic science errors, that does happen. And then an interesting point here, the ratification of error. So that's something that's seen commonly, and it's not just in the judicial system. I see it at my work all the time. But as things go up in kind of the bureaucratic levels of the system, people are asked at higher levels to sign off or approve something. And it's the concept of the ratification of error is the tendency of somebody higher up to rubber stamp a decision that somebody below them made, assuming that everything's well and good, and then you're approving something that's not right. So at this point in the article, we've really just listed facts and what we see historically here in the United States, but this is where Dr. Huff really comes in and starts communicating his opinion. So one of the primary contextual factors that he believes leads to wrongful convictions is what he describes and what is commonly described as an adversarial system. So what an adversarial system means is that it's based on the defense and the prosecution arguing against each other, and being able to allow the facts to come forward and allow the jury and the judge to make a decision based on those. The inequity lies in the fact that the prosecution almost always has more resources as far as budgeting, as far as manpower, as far as investigative abilities. The defense often is not able to come up with their own investigation or do something outside, and so they're relying on the facts that were produced by the prosecution team and the police. In order for an adversarial system like we have here in the U.S. to work, the investigation has to be objective and thorough. And as one can imagine, that's not always the case, and that can lead to wrongful convictions. Over the last 20 years, the United States has made strides towards reducing the risk at wrongful convictions. In 2003, there was an act passed called the Innocence Protection Act that is aimed at reducing the possibility that innocent persons be executed. It allows convicted offenders to have access to DNA evidence that could possibly exonerate them. It allows for proper defense for those who have been accused. And it also allows for anybody who is the victim of a wrongful conviction to recover financially from that and receive at least some sort of benefit from the wrongful conviction. Innocence projects in law schools are another thing that have developed over the past few years and has been really helpful in wrongful convictions. So innocence projects are in almost every state now, although not every state. And it allows law students to provide pro bono legal work to offenders who are claiming innocence. And then innocence commissions are commissions that are put together, and some states have them and some do not. But they are commissions that are put together and review cases where offenders are claiming to be innocent. And Dr. Huff here points out that he believes that those should be a requirement and should be established at both federal and state levels. So the nature of wrongful convictions over the past 10 years and their high publicity have called into question the use of the death penalty. And actually, the former governor of Illinois called a moratorium on the use of the death penalty in that state following a period of time where more death row inmates were exonerated than were convicted. So again, Dr. Huff goes into his personal opinion, believing that the death penalty should be abolished and should be replaced with sentences of 20 years, 30 years, or life without parole. Given the number of errors that are found in the judicial system, sentences should be able to be repealed. So the impacts of wrongful conviction here in the U.S. are very similar to the impacts of wrongful conviction in the judicial system in Canada. So those are directly the impacts on those who are wrongfully convicted and potentially spent time in jail for crimes that they did not commit. Loss of public confidence in the judicial system. So this is a big one. Every time there is a wrongful conviction that is publicly followed, individuals then are going to naturally lose confidence in the justice system. And then, of course, the threat to public safety when the offenders who are not in jail are free to commit more offenses. Um, so in conclusion, Dr. Huff really just pushes for more research and more some reform of the death penalty, which you mentioned earlier, but more research and more data to back up what's going on, what drives wrongful convictions in the U.S., and how we can get better at eliminating the risk. And that is everything. Thank you very much for listening.